Well, partly this is what I know. And it's something, when I was in my early 20s, I was writing all sorts of stories. And I wrote a few of these stories about these sort of guys. And an editor named Josh Glenn, who was the editor of Hermenaut. And, and these stories, they're not in the book. They didn't make it into the book. They weren't very good. And he said, but he read the stories and he didn't take them for Hermenaut. He didn't publish them. But he said, you should keep doing this. I don't know anyone who knows these people the way you do. And I was surprised to hear that because I thought everybody knew these people the way I did. And in a way everybody does. And yet there's actually surprisingly little writing about them. And one of the really, to me, not terribly surprising, but still disappointing criticism of the book has been, well, why do we need to hear about these guys? We all know guys just like them, right? Which strikes me as an invalid form of literary criticism, but also it strikes me as a refusal of a certain kind of person to admit that they belong to a social class. So, you're willing. So these are people who, and often this sort of criticism comes from New York. It's a kind of provincial criticism from people who believe that their own little world is not worthy of depiction in literature. Whereas, first of all, it's not just New York. There are young literary men all over the country and in other countries. So it's a mistake and a provincial mistake to think that they're only in New York. But more than that, this is actually something that Medvedev talks about. The intelligentsia, right, or in the U.S., the sad young literary men and women, they form a social class, and they have to admit that to themselves because while they're willing to be a social class in terms of using their privilege, if they have money, their money privilege, their access to various media, which is a form of privilege, and all the various networks that they have access to from the colleges that they went to. Somehow they refuse to believe that they're a social class that ought to be depicted in literature, except unless it's totally ironic, right? And they do, and this is where hipster culture comes from, right? So we have a hipster culture that in a way acknowledges that it exists as a class, and yet only ironically, right? And one of the most unattractive things about the hipster phenomenon is its classing down, right? Its insistence on this form of kitsch where they wear trucker hats, right? Where they pretend to be from a different social class, right? This is a very good example of this group of people refusing to acknowledge their class privilege. So to get back to the book, the sad young literary men are a social class. They ought to be written about. They ought to be studied. And surprisingly, you would think everybody would be writing about them because we're all in it. And surprisingly little seems to be written about it. And I think, I also hope that the book is pretty honest about the way these people behave and how badly they behave. I think we have a fair amount of literature that deals with men behaving badly, but the men are often depicted as total cads, total lowlifes, total losers. These guys are more complicated than that. They are capable of being very sweet and sort of supportive and nice, and then also not so nice.